Seven signs. Your relationship is based on dependence, not love. There's a version of love that doesn't quite feel like love. Most people don't realize they're in it until much later. It makes it hard to imagine being without someone, not because they make your life richer, but because the thought of losing them produces something closer to panic than to sadness. It's actually one of the most common patterns in adult relationships. And what makes it genuinely complicated is this: dependence and love can look almost identical from the outside. They both involve closeness. They both involve care. But the underlying structure, the mechanism running beneath the surface, is completely different. This isn't about whether your relationship is good or bad. That's not the point. The point is to give you a clear map of observable signs, specific recognizable patterns that can help you understand what's actually driving the connection you're in. Because understanding the difference changes how you see things, and seeing things clearly is the first step to responding to them with intelligence rather than habit. There's also a reason this distinction matters beyond the relationship itself. When dependence is the primary driver, it tends to create a specific kind of chronic psychological cost, one that operates quietly below the level of dramatic events and shapes how you experience yourself day to day. That cost is worth understanding, not to generate alarm, but to give you a more accurate picture of what's happening. So let's get into the 7 signs. The first one is something that often gets misread. Think about this for a moment. When your partner comes home after a long day apart or texts you back after a few hours of silence, what do you actually feel in that first moment? If the honest answer is relief, that's worth paying attention to. In a relationship rooted in genuine affection, connection typically produces something like warmth, interest, or pleasure. But in a relationship driven by dependence, the dominant emotion when someone returns isn't joy. It's the release of tension. The relationship isn't providing something positive. It's temporarily removing something negative. That's a fundamentally different experience. The pattern usually works like this. When the person is present and attentive, you feel okay. When they're unavailable, physically or emotionally, you feel anxious, restless, or quietly distressed. So when they return, you feel relieved, not elevated. Not genuinely happy, just no longer uncomfortable. Relief is what you feel when a threat is removed. Joy is what you feel when something good arrives. These aren't the same thing, and your nervous system knows the difference even if your mind doesn't. A micro variation of this worth noticing. Some people experience it most clearly during arguments. The argument itself is painful, but when it ends, regardless of whether anything was actually resolved, there's a powerful flood of relief. The anxiety drops. You feel close again. The resolution didn't come from clarity or understanding. It came from the temporary disappearance of tension, and so the pattern simply repeats. The second sign is subtle, but once you see it, it becomes very hard to miss. When a dependent dynamic is active, one person's mood functions almost like a thermostat for the other. If your partner is happy, you feel safe. If they're irritated, withdrawn, or just distracted, your internal state shifts. Even if nothing happened between you, you may not even realize you're doing it. You check their tone when they walk in. You read their face before you speak. You gauge their energy before deciding how to act. This is sometimes mistaken for emotional sensitivity, for attunement to your partner. But there's a real distinction. Genuine attunement involves noticing someone else's state while maintaining your own internal ground. Dependent regulation involves your state being determined by theirs. You stop being a separate person with your own emotional weather. You become a mirror. The practical consequence of this is significant. If your ability to feel calm, confident, or comfortable in your own skin requires another person to be in a particular state, your emotional stability is no longer really yours. It becomes something that can be disrupted or temporarily granted by someone else's behavior. And here's where it gets more complex. When this pattern is in place, you may unconsciously try to regulate your partner's mood in order to regulate your own. If they seem irritated, you become hyper-aware. You soften your tone. You avoid topics that might escalate things. Not because you're being thoughtful, but because their irritation is uncomfortable for you in a very direct, almost physiological way. You're managing them to manage yourself. That's a very different dynamic from care. The third sign involves a standard you hold for how people treat you. It applies to colleagues, to friends, to strangers. But at some point, without realizing it, you started applying a completely different standard to your partner. The fear of losing the relationship, or the fear of the emotional disruption that confrontation would cause, begins to override your capacity to enforce your own limits. You know something isn't okay, but bringing it up feels more costly than absorbing it. This isn't about dramatic scenarios. It shows up in quiet, everyday moments. You said something that genuinely bothered you and then immediately walked it back. You noticed a pattern of dismissal or inconsistency, and you explained it away. You felt something was clearly off, and you stayed quiet because the alternative, the conversation, the tension, the possible reaction, seemed worse than whatever you were tolerating. The signal here isn't just that you let something go. Everyone does that sometimes, and that's normal. The signal is that there's a consistent gap between what you experience internally and what you're willing to address externally. And that gap is maintained not by indifference, but by a specific, quiet fear of what addressing it might cost. A useful question: would you accept this same behavior from a close friend? If the answer is consistently no, and you're still accepting it from your partner, that asymmetry is worth examining. Not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity about what's making the gap feel necessary. The fourth sign unfolds slowly, which is part of why it's easy to miss. Early in a dependent dynamic, it might just look like closeness. You want to spend more time together. You become less interested in things you used to do alone. You start organizing more of your life around the relationship. None of this feels alarming at first. It might even feel like the relationship is going well. But over time, a pattern solidifies. The friendships you had before receive less attention. The interests and activities that were distinctly yours, separate from the relationship, gradually fade. Your social world contracts toward a single center. When someone asks who you are, the first answers that come to mind are about the relationship. When you imagine the future, you struggle to picture one that doesn't involve this person, not because you've built something meaningful together, but because the alternative produces a blank, or something worse than a blank. Identity erosion in a dependent relationship isn't about choosing someone. It's about losing access to the parts of yourself that existed before they arrived, and gradually becoming unable to reach them independently. The observable micro-variation. Pay attention to what happens when you have time that isn't organized around the relationship. An afternoon alone, a day without contact. Does that time feel like freedom, space you can use? Or does it feel like something is missing in a way that makes it hard to simply be with yourself? If solitude without them consistently feels like a problem to solve rather than time to inhabit, that's informative. The fifth sign follows a loop that many people find deeply frustrating, partly because they can see the loop clearly and still can't easily step out of it. In a relationship with a dependent dynamic, reassurance tends to work like this. You feel uncertain. You seek confirmation, a text, a word, a gesture, some signal that things are okay. The confirmation comes, you feel better, and then the uncertainty returns, often not long afterward. So you seek reassurance again. The reassurance is real. The comfort it provides is real, but it doesn't resolve the underlying state. It only temporarily quiets it. This cycle reveals something important about the structure of what's happening. The person seeking reassurance may genuinely not be able to access a stable sense of security from inside themselves, and so they've effectively placed that function on the relationship. The relationship becomes the source of an internal stability that ideally would be self-generated. A common misreading of this pattern is to frame it as a trust issue between two specific people. Sometimes it is. But often, the problem isn't that the partner is untrustworthy. It's that no amount of external confirmation can fully satisfy an internal state of uncertainty. The signal keeps returning because the system generating it hasn't changed. The consequence over time is predictable. The partner being asked for reassurance begins to feel pressure they can't fully resolve because the goalposts keep moving, and the person seeking it begins to feel frustration that reassurance never seems to be enough. Both observations are accurate. They're just describing different parts of the same loop. The sixth sign is one that people often notice but rarely name clearly. Love, in its functional form, tends to create a sense of ease. That doesn't mean absence of conflict. Real relationships have friction, disagreement, and genuine difficulty. But beneath those moments, there's usually a baseline sense of stability, a quiet confidence that the connection is solid even when a specific interaction is hard. In a dependent relationship, that baseline often doesn't exist, or it exists only conditionally, when the other person is present, attentive, and behaving in a particular way. The moment any of those conditions shift, the baseline disappears. This shows up as a relationship that is emotionally tiring, even when nothing dramatic is happening. You spend mental energy monitoring, you interpret messages carefully, you read silences, you prepare for possible tensions, you run quiet background processes wondering if things are okay. Not because there's clear evidence they aren't, but because the state of the relationship never fully settles. Research on anxious attachment confirms this pattern with some consistency. More anxiously attached individuals report higher levels of physiological stress in relationship contexts, greater interference in daily functioning, and a reduced ability to access the calming effects of social support, even when support is genuinely available. The relationship becomes not just an emotional experience, but a persistent source of low-level activation that the nervous system has to manage continuously. If you look at the overall texture of your day-to-day experience in the relationship and anxious is more accurate than at ease, that's not a minor detail. That's a structural description of how the connection is actually functioning. The seventh sign is the most clarifying of all. There's a meaningful difference between choosing to stay in a relationship and being unable to leave it. The first is a decision made from values, affection, and honest assessment of what matters to you. The second is a state in which the possibility of leaving feels foreclosed, not because of anything logical, but because the prospect generates such significant emotional disruption that the mind simply treats it as off the table. You can be unhappy in a relationship and still feel unable to leave. That's worth sitting with. Most people would assume that being unhappy would produce motivation to exit. In a psychologically stable dynamic, it often does, or at least it produces serious reflection. But in a dependent structure, unhappiness and the inability to leave can coexist without contradiction. The discomfort inside the relationship is real. The anticipated discomfort of losing the relationship is just worse. The fear here is usually described as fear of loneliness, but it tends to be more specific than that. It's fear of a particular internal state, the state that would exist if this person were no longer filling a specific psychological function. In emotional dependence, the partner isn't just someone you love, they're a regulatory mechanism, an emotional anchor, a source of identity and structure. Losing them doesn't just mean losing someone important, it means losing the architecture that keeps certain internal experiences manageable. Here's a concrete example to make this observable. Imagine someone who can see clearly that the relationship isn't working. They can articulate the problems, they understand what a rational outside perspective would likely suggest. And yet, when they genuinely consider leaving, the response is something closer to dread than to grief. That dread isn't about missing someone. It's about the prospect of becoming the sole source of one's own stability and not being confident that's possible. That's the sign, not "I'd miss them, but I don't know who I am without them." Now, and this matters, recognizing any of these signs doesn't mean something is broken beyond repair, or that your relationship has no value, or that you've done something wrong. Dependence in relationships is extraordinarily common. It develops through understandable psychological processes, early attachment experiences, learned patterns of safety seeking. The gradual way proximity to someone can reshape your internal structure without you ever making a deliberate choice for that to happen. What recognizing these signs does give you is a more accurate picture of what's operating, and accuracy is what makes better responses possible. So let's be specific about what better responses actually look like. Practically, not abstractly. The first shift is learning to distinguish between relief-seeking and genuine connection. When you feel the pull to reach out, to check in, to confirm, it's worth pausing briefly and asking, what am I actually looking for right now? Am I trying to connect, or am I trying to quiet anxiety? You don't have to suppress either impulse, but identifying which one is running gives you more agency about how you respond to it. The second shift is about gradually rebuilding access to your own stability, not by distancing yourself from the relationship, but by reintroducing things that exist independently of it. Activities that are yours, time that belongs to you, relationships outside this one that still have weight. This isn't about creating separation. It's about restoring the foundation that makes healthy closeness actually possible, because closeness built on the absence of self isn't closeness, it's fusion. The third shift involves the reassurance loop. When the anxious activation occurs, the urge to check, to ask, to seek confirmation, the practical experiment is to stay with that state for a short period before acting on it. Not forever, not as a test of willpower. Just long enough to notice that the discomfort, while real, is manageable. That gap between the signal and the response is small at first, but that gap is where choice lives, and it gets wider with practice. And the fourth, about the discrepancy between what you experience internally and what you're willing to address externally. The work here isn't about manufacturing confrontation or issuing demands. It's about simply noticing the gap honestly, naming it to yourself, recognizing when you're tolerating something because it's actually fine versus when you're tolerating it because the alternative feels too costly. That noticing, practiced consistently, is what gradually allows a more honest relationship with yourself, which is ultimately what changes the dynamic. Dependence isn't a character flaw, it's a pattern. It developed for reasons that made sense at the time, in conditions that required a certain kind of adaptation. It served a function, and understanding how that pattern operates, seeing its architecture clearly, is what makes it possible to respond differently. Not to transform everything overnight, not through a single decision or a dramatic turning point, but through small moments of greater clarity, greater self-reference, and greater capacity to be with yourself, introduced gradually into a dynamic that has, until now, been running mostly on anxiety and habit. That's what these 7 signs point toward. Not a verdict on your relationship, not a prescription for what to do next, just a clearer map, and with a clearer map, you can start to navigate differently. Subscribe for more psychological analyses like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed in something that felt hard to leave, even when you knew it wasn't working?